Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris. This is Defending Israel. This is our first new show in 2025, and I want to talk about the year ahead. But first, I'd like to dial back 90 or even 100 years to one of my recurring themes on this show, and that is the lessons of the 1920s and 1930s, because they are very, very applicable today. The two main lessons that I have stressed are, first, the failure of imagination. Let me cite for you, for example, a headline in the New York Times from December 20th, 1924, almost exactly 1 century ago. The headline reads, "Hitler tamed by prison." And it goes on to say, his, meaning Hitler's behavior during imprisonment, convinced the authorities that, like his political organization, he was no longer to be feared. It is believed he will retire to private life and return to Austria, the country of his birth. 9 years later, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, January 30th, 1933. And by March 23rd of 1933, he had become the undisputed ruler through the enabling legislation, which meant he could bypass the Reichstag or the parliament. Just a few weeks after that, though, Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State, said to Time magazine, and again I quote, "Mistreatment of Jews in Germany may be considered virtually eliminated." Walter Lippmann, perhaps the most prominent journalist of his era, and an individual of German Jewish background, later in 1933 said the following: "The outer world will do well to accept the evidence of German goodwill and seek by all possible means to meet it and to justify it." In 1937, the Prime Minister of Canada, who served 13 years in that post, traveled to Nazi Germany, and he said after his visit, I quote, "Looking back on the German visit, I can honestly say it was as enjoyable, informative, and inspiring as any visit I have ever had anywhere." And about the same time, David Lloyd George, who had served earlier as a British Prime Minister from Wales, called Adolf Hitler the George Washington of his country. And of course, as so many of you know, after the third and final meeting between Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and Adolf Hitler in Germany in September 1938, that was the Munich visit, Chamberlain came back to big crowds and announced, "I bring you peace with honor." This means peace in our time. And the French Prime Minister, not to be outdone by Chamberlain, he famously said at the same time, "I am certain today, September 30th, 1938, that thanks to the desire to make mutual concessions, and thanks to our spirit of collaboration, which has animated the actions of the four great powers, Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, peace is saved." All of this is to say, of course, that otherwise good, thoughtful, intelligent Western men, politicians, journalists, intellectuals, all got it wrong, which led Winston Churchill, who had been that voice in the wilderness throughout so much of the early Hitler period, to say that one day President Franklin Roosevelt told me he was asking publicly for suggestions about what the war should be called. And I said, referring to World War II, it should be called the unnecessary war, meaning that had those otherwise good, thoughtful, intelligent people understood the nature of extremism, the nature of Hitler's ideology, had they not blinded themselves, had they not sought to appease him one step after another in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in Spain, in the Rhineland, in Austria, go down the list of appeasements, maybe this war would not have happened. And maybe some 60 million people would not have lost their lives. And maybe some 6 million Jews would not have been annihilated in the Holocaust. The central lessons for today are: one, a failure of imagination to understand extremism. And secondly, the temptation to appease in the hope that by offering some crumbs, you can satisfy the tyrants. And that brings me now to the new year, to 2025. And I'm not going to go through my resolutions, personal or otherwise, but I do want to take you through my wish list of what I hope we will see in this new year. First and foremost, I hope we will see Israel continue to be strong, determined, focused, creative, ingenious, and victorious in war on at least 7 fronts, war that was inflicted on Israel. And I have to say, and I know I've said it before in this show, that though Israel was caught off guard on October the 7th, 2023, and the devastation and the barbarism were there for all of us to witness, Israel's recovery, its ability to take the war to its declared enemies, and to show a remarkable spine and courage and valor and national unity, notwithstanding all of the daily political issues in the country, to me is a model. While other countries, including big countries, strong countries in the West, again, had a failure of imagination to understand what's going on in the Middle East, had a temptation to appease, had a preoccupation with de-escalation at all costs. Israel showed the world what standing up to evil looks like. So I wish Israel continued unity, strength, and success. And of course, hope as soon as possible to see the remaining hostages, both those that are alive and tragically those who are no longer alive, but their bodies be returned to Israel and to their loved ones. That is my overwhelming hope. But there's more. I hope that 2025 will be the year that we see more weakening of Iran. Iran is the head of the snake. When we speak about Hamas or the Houthis or Hezbollah, we're really talking about Iran as the principal funder, supplier of weapons, inspiration for these satellites of Iran. Israel exposed Iran's weakness while other countries trembled in the face of Iran. Israel has gone inside Iran. Israel has taken out individuals, dangerous individuals, under the noses of the Iranian regime. Israel has also destroyed many of the air defense systems, leaving Iran much more vulnerable. And at the same time, Iran has a weakened economy. And at the same time, Iran has lost its satellite in President Assad of Syria, who's now starting a new life in Russia, while a new regime emerges in Syria. Iran is weak. Iran is on the ropes. Will Israel have to face Iran alone in 2025? Or will other countries led by the United States join together to further weaken and decapitate Iran? We know that many in Iran are desperate for a new regime, a liberal regime, an open regime. Will it be the year 2025 when we see that? Will 2025 be the year that we see once again a focus on the Abraham Accords and expanding that remarkable circle of peace? We all recall to this day 1979, when Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty that has held remarkably, now in its 46th year. We all remember 1994, when what had been a quiet de facto peace with Jordan became an open, de jure peace between Israel and Jordan. And that too has held through thick and thin for the last 31 years. And then in the year 2020, we witnessed 4 additional countries enter the circle of peace in what became known as the Abraham Accords. And remarkably, since October 7th of 2023, those countries have held in their relations with Israel. And we applaud the position of the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco in particular in strengthening the circle of peace. And obviously, the big question, as Tony Blinken himself said in a recent interview in the New York Times, the big prize is Saudi Arabia. Will 2025 be the year when Saudi Arabia formally, officially joins the circle of peace, which would be a game changer, given its centrality to the Middle East and to the Muslim world? And if it did, would some other countries follow as well, tipping the scales further towards peace and coexistence and cooperation in the region, and further weakening the Iranian-led axis? In the year 2025, we have another much more complicated question to confront, and that question is Turkey. Now, in principle, it should be easy. After all, Turkey is a member of NATO. NATO is a Western security alliance of like-minded nations, and yet Turkey is always the outlier. It's too big, many think, to be kicked out of NATO, if that's even possible, and yet it doesn't behave like a NATO member nation either. It has imperial ambitions in North Africa, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course in the Middle East itself, most recently now in Syria. So who's going to stand up to Turkey? Are we going to continue in both Republican and Democratic administrations to appease Turkey, to presume that it is too big for us to challenge? The consequences could be too great? Or are we going to stand up to President Erdogan and his Muslim Brotherhood agenda, and again his efforts to, in a way, reconstruct the Ottoman Empire, but this time with the tinge of the Muslim Brotherhood, to which he is so affiliated, and its extremist ideology? Which brings us to another partner of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that is Qatar. And again, we have witnessed repeated American administrations of both political parties that have closed their eyes, averted their eyes, appeased. Qatar is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the extremist Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar is very skillful at playing all sides against the middle. But Qatar has also been home to notable terrorists, individuals, and terrorist organizations. Qatar funds Al Jazeera, which many believe is not a media outlet, but a propaganda tool of the Qatari Muslim Brotherhood regime, which is why in a number of countries, by the way, most recently in the Palestinian Authority, Al Jazeera has been banned. So what are we going to do about Qatar? And that brings me to a related issue. As some of you have seen on this show and also on the ISGAP Hour, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which has done such important work on this subject, Qatar is the largest single foreign funder of American higher education today. And the question asked by ISGAP and others is, why? Do they really care about advancing scholarship in French literature or in the history of Latin America? No, they have an agenda. It's a clear, if sometimes subtle, agenda. And there are laws on the books here in the United States which have not been applied in recent years. Laws such as Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, which says, any university in the United States must report semi-annually any gifts from foreign donors of $250,000 or more. That's there in black and white, and yet many universities have arrogantly ignored it, and Washington has largely given them a pass. It's time in 2025 to enforce the laws on the books, if not to strengthen them still further. Why should Qatar, a nation of some 300 or 350,000 people, 5,000 or 6,000 miles away from the United States, be the principal funder of higher education? And to what degree is their agenda to instill, in one way or another, the Muslim Brotherhood outlook, which is such a threat to the United States? Will 2025 be the year, after witnessing such a surge in anti-Semitism, a tsunami of anti-Semitism on a number of campuses, will it be the year when the federal government uses the tools at its command to begin to extract the price, to punish those universities that are unwilling or unable to protect their Jewish students in violation of Title VI? Will this be the year? In 2024, we saw a few universities, but many others that chose to look the other way, chose to pretend it wasn't a real problem, kick the can down the road, or maybe even tell Jewish students, we can't protect you on campus, so please go home, you can finish this semester from home. A complete and total abdication of responsibility on the part of the university. And of course, the best example of that, not the only one by any stretch, is Columbia University. Will the White House, the relevant ministries, and both houses of Congress begin to punish those universities? And they have the tools, beginning with federal funding, in order to send a much clearer message, not just in words, but in actions that universities will feel. More generally, on the subject of surging anti-Semitism, will there be, and I think this is a key word for 2025, I'll call it the C word, consequences. Will there be consequences throughout the nation for anti-Semitism, acts of anti-Semitism that morph into threats of violence and intimidation? Yes, we have free speech, and I, for one, am not challenging the rights of free speech. But when free speech transitions to intimidation and threats or actual acts of violence, then words are not enough. We need consequences at all levels of government. We need consequences by universities themselves. We need consequences by mayors and governors. And again, I go back to the federal government. We need to send a clear message that anti-Semitism, whatever its guise may be, whatever its source may be, whether from the extreme right, the extreme left, or jihadist sources, is un-American and unacceptable, and when appropriate, will be punished. Again, the key word for 2025, consequences. And here I speak not only of the United States, for heaven's sakes, to our north, Canada. There has been a rise, an estimated rise of more than 600% in anti-Semitic incidents in Canada, a country that for so many we viewed as the perfect expression of tolerance and multiculturalism and coexistence. And yet it's gone wild, including shootings at schools, desecrations of synagogues, the need by adults to accompany children to Jewish day schools because those children were feeling endangered and threatened. And yet, to a very large degree, the current Canadian government decided that this did not rise to the level of urgency. It must. The same in Great Britain, the same in Australia, the same across continental Europe. We need to see heightened attention to anti-Semitism. We need to see not just statements on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, or nice holiday messages for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, or Hanukkah or Passover. Those are all welcome. But they cannot and must not be seen as substitutes for the action that's needed. And remember, as has been said repeatedly by so many, when anti-Semitism rears its head in this kind of dramatic, dangerous way, no one is safe. No one is safe. Democracy, above all, is not safe. The fabric of democratic society, of pluralism, of intergroup relations is threatened. And those who would attack the Jews and attack the synagogues could be attacking others as well the day after if their plans go through. So what will be done about anti-Semitism? And then it brings me to my next hope in 2025. I go back to the failure of imagination in the 1920s and 30s. There are still too many Western leaders that fail to understand the notion of Islamic extremism. I'm not talking about Islam as a religion. I'm talking about those who've chosen to give it an extremist interpretation and who believe that they are commanded by their understanding of Islam to go after the infidel, to murder the Jew or the Christian, the Saturday people or the Sunday people as they're sometimes called, that this is part of their fulfillment of their religion and their obligation to their own spiritual figures. We need to confront this. We can't hide. We can't pretend that it's not a clear and present danger. I recall as early as the 1990s, meeting with Arab leaders in the Middle East and North Africa who said to us, their Western Jewish visitors, why doesn't the West understand what's going on under their noses? We try and ban the Muslim Brotherhood, or later Al Jazeera, or other such groups, and you permit them. So our young people or our dissidents, those extremist dissidents, find refuge in your societies. And that's where they nurture their hatred. And that's where they recruit and build their networks. And that's where they establish their propaganda platforms, because you allow them and enable them to do that. Will 2025 be the year when Western societies, including the United States, confront the realities, making clear distinctions between those who seek peace and seek integration and seek coexistence and cooperation on the one hand, versus those who, like the car rammer in New Orleans, felt inspired by ISIS ideology to kill as many as he could and to wound as many others as he could. West, wake up. America, wake up. Wake up to the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood. Wake up to the reality of Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. Wake up to CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and other groups which purport out of one side of their mouth to speak the language of the West, but from the other side of their mouth seek to undermine the core values, not just of Jews, but of the West more generally, of their host societies more specifically. And last on my wish list, well, actually it's not last, but last within the time constraints of this show, I hope 2025 will be a year when the Jewish community, starting right here in the United States, all 6 or 7 million of us become stronger, prouder, and more knowledgeable. I believe that at the end of the day, when we ask ourselves, what is it that we can and should be doing as a community in the face of what we've witnessed since October the 7th especially? Obviously, we should be petitioning the government. We should be petitioning our alma maters, all the things that we've talked about in the last 25 or so minutes. But I think the single most important thing for us to do is to understand why we are Jews, to reaffirm our commitment to our Jewish identity, to the Jewish community, to the Jewish people, to recognize that Zionism is an integral part of our Jewish identity. We don't have an a la carte menu. Zionism, Zion, Jerusalem, Judea, these are all parts of our heritage. This is part of our journey over the last several thousand years. We don't get to say yes to parts of that identity and reject other parts as if they're dispensable. And especially for our young people who are going to go out into high schools and universities and who, as Jews or friends of Israel, may face challenges, even physical threats. We have to help our young people understand why it's worth facing the risks and the challenges if they exist in order to affirm our pride and our journey. And there's lots of reason for pride. The more I explored my own Jewish heritage, and I was relatively late. I didn't have my first Shabbat dinner until I was in my early 20s. I left Hebrew school shortly after my bar mitzvah. So it was only later that I began to read and question and explore and discover and understand that I too am an heir of an extraordinary civilization, an extraordinary heritage, an extraordinary journey through thick and thin. Jews who tenaciously cling to their identity in the face of every imaginable evil over thousands of years, and here we are today. And I would suggest, if I may, that what many of us need is actually a spinal transplant. Because it takes a little bit more courage today to be a Jew than it did 10 or 20 years ago in America or Canada or Britain or Australia or France or Germany. So where's the spinal transplant going to come from? It's going to come from those young Israelis, young women and young men who wear uniforms or in some cases don't wear uniforms, but are there on the front lines defending this small country the size of New Jersey, or for overseas viewers, 2/3 the size of tiny Belgium, who've stood up to some of the greatest barbarism and evil on the planet, who have never flinched, who have been willing to risk their lives and in some cases give their lives to defend this country, this one Jewish majority nation that we have been so privileged, so blessed to experience in our own lifetimes. It's they who should give us the courage. And it's from them that we should be receiving the spinal transplant. Compared to what they're confronting on a daily basis, our challenges are not quite as daunting or life-threatening. So let 2025 be the year when we stood up together, each of us saying, Hineni, here I am, proud of our Jewish identity, defending our Jewish identity, and standing up for this great nation, the United States, and for all liberal democracies, including the State of Israel. Dear viewers, thank you for listening. This is David Harris defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.